Philip, Philip and Patrick for organising this. Now, just checking, Paul, you can see my screen okay, my PowerPoint screen, yes?
I can, yeah. It looks fine
Yep,
to me.
perfect. That's great stuff. Because I'm working off an iPad. So if anything goes drastically wrong, just let me know, and I should hopefully be able to fix it. Okay. So anyway, excuse me. It's a well-known fact that the last three Mortimer Earls each died in Ireland. The last three Mortimer Earls of March. Edmund, the third Earl, died at Cork in December 1381, probably from some sort of a chill he got from crossing a river while campaigning a little bit further north in kind of North Munster, and while moving southwards. His son and successor, as you will know, well know, Roger, he is killed in a skirmish near Carlow in 1398. And fittingly, in his obituary provided by Adam Usk, he is described as dying of an excess of military ardour. So, what a way to go is all I'll say there. And his son, Edmund, the last of the Mortimer Earls of March and Ulster, died at Trim in 1425 from plague. Now, that's all. I mean, again, I'm very much aware that I'm speaking to the Mortimer Society. You know all this off by heart by this stage. I would just like to point out that like the Earls, I've done a little bit of sums here, and Patrick can probably correct me if I'm wrong. But as far as I'm aware, they were not in Ireland for particularly long. It's certainly less than 4 years that they're in Ireland. I've worked it out at around 36 months, maybe a little bit longer. So in terms of just from a purely temporal perspective or chronological perspective, they're not in Ireland for a particularly long time. It's brief, their actual physical engagement with Ireland. As absentee Earls, yes, they have lots of engagement with Ireland, but their actual physical presence in Ireland is actually quite limited. That being said, they have a profound but uneven impact upon the Irish political landscape. Okay, so they left their mark upon Irish politics quite significantly, despite the fact that they were only in Ireland for a brief period. Today, anyway, please forgive me, I'm going to offer a speculative or a counterfactual approach to looking at the Mortimers in Ireland. Hopefully, this will make more sense as the talk goes on. If I was setting an essay question for one of my undergraduate classes, this is what I would set. If the Mortimers had lived longer, how would they have managed their Irish inheritance? That's the kind of the essay question, if you like, that I want to talk about, want to explore in some detail today. I want to think about, what was late medieval Ireland like, and how could the Mortimers have engaged with it? What were the strategies available to them? And I want to focus on two key elements here. There, a potential dynastic strategy, and perhaps more importantly, I would say, to what extent could they have engaged with this idea of cultural accommodation, integration? How could they have, I suppose, number one, could they have interacted in a more meaningful sense with the indigenous Irish aristocracy? And if so, what would that have looked like? So they're just some of the questions I want to talk about. Now, I'll begin by giving a very brief overview of their reasons for being in Ireland. Again, this is old hat for everyone here. We all know what has to do with their inheritance, the de Burgh inheritance that they acquire in the 1360s. They inherit an enormous property portfolio in Ireland when Edmund Mortimer marries Philippa, daughter of Lionel of Clarence. This makes them overnight one of the largest, or the largest nominal landholders in Ireland. I want to talk a little bit about the state of English power in Ireland in the late Middle Ages, because the questions I want to ask, or the questions I want to explore, we need to look at them in context today. So when talking about the state of English power in Ireland, talking about the Mortimer's place in all this, there are, I suppose, certain elements of historical debate I'd like to tease out or explore in some more detail. Firstly, the nature of English lordship in Ireland. Okay, there's been some very interesting things written about the state of English power in Ireland at this time. I want to tease out the debate a little bit, talk about some of the very interesting work that's been done, but also some of the areas that perhaps could be developed in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to say a little bit about the relationship between the colonial nobility and Irish culture, because funnily enough, this is a very contentious area of scholarship. It became quite contentious about 40 years ago. It died down for a little bit, and it's still a point of friction within the historiography of late medieval Ireland. So that's something I'll talk about a little bit more detail. So in that regard, I want to talk about the historiography of this topic as well. So again, I'll talk about these debates and say a little bit about where the Mortimers, I think, fit into all of this. So by all means, feel free to agree or disagree with me, and we can have a bit of a chat in the Q&A afterwards. Now, again, it doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it all the same. The Mortimers, again, had one of the three, or had all three of them lived until old age, they had the potential to become the most important comital house in Ireland, and I would say the most important resident comital house. Okay, for most of their lives, they were absentees. But had they lived longer and had things played outside differently, there was the potential to become the most important comital family in Ireland. Okay, so again, going back to this idea of how could they have ruled their vast inheritance, and I want to talk about or think about, the non-military, non-confrontational strategies and resources that they could have used. Okay, so a lot of what we know about the Mortimers, a lot of what's been written about them, reflects the historical record, of course. But it focuses on their military campaigns really in Ireland. Thinking about Edmund, who died on the way to Cork in 1381, thinking about Roger and his bellicose activities in Ulster and Leinster, and finally Edmund, who dies at Trim from plague. Okay, so the emphasis has very much been on the military activities of the Mortimers, with good reason, in Ireland. But I'd like to look beyond that and think a little bit about, what other strategies were available to the Mortimers or their contemporaries at this time. So can other successful colonial magnates, so people like the Butlers or Fitzgeralds in Ireland, can they offer a template for how a colonial dynasty could have managed their territory, managed their affairs over a longer period of time? Okay. Now, this is very much a whistle-stop tour of a couple of centuries of Irish history, and it will be familiar to a lot of people. But just in case you're not that familiar with Irish history, I'll just sketch out some of the main developments. So again, it's a well-known fact that before the invasions of the 1160s, at the dawn of the 1160s, Ireland was ruled by several royal dynasties. There's about 4, possibly 5 key families or dominant families in Ireland, provincial kings effectively, that are each jostling for dominance with one another, trying to establish their authority across the island. Okay, but it's no one family controls the entire island. There are periods when certain kings establish a hegemony over their rivals, but it never lasts more than a generation. So that this kind of struggle for dominance has very much characterized the political landscape of the island from about the year 1000 through to the mid-12th century. So on the eve of the Norman or the English invasions, I'll just call them English. We won't get into the politics of that, but I will call them English. On the eve of the English invasions of the late 1160s, Ireland is a fragmented political landscape. Okay, there are a number of dynasties, each jostling for power with one another. There is no political unity amongst the Irish, and this facilitates the conquest of Ireland, or at least it facilitates the conquest of significant areas of the island over the coming century. I would describe the conquest as kind of exponential. It starts off relatively slowly at first. Again, it focuses on the eastern seaboard. Landings are made in Wexford, Waterford. Dublin is taken by 1171. In the first 10-15 years, all the key towns, like I said, Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, Limerick, these are all Viking foundations. They're all taken. Dublin becomes the kind of the new nerve centre or the new capital for the English lordship of Ireland. Many of the indigenous lineages, the indigenous Irish lineages that had ruled the island or parts of the island for centuries, are displaced or they're pushed back into less fertile regions of the island. A range of, or a cast of new colonial families of Anglo-French extraction are introduced into the island, and you can see them flying here. I'm very proud of that animation. I thought it was very swish. Thank you. That's just to give you examples. So you can see, I don't have a pointer on this, but the green sheave, the green and kind of beige and red shield is William Marshall. You've got the butlers just left of him. You've got the Burghs, the red cross on a yellow background, Fitzgerald's white, red cross on a white background, and then up in Ulster, in kind of modern day County Down, you've got de Courcy, and also the purple and yellow shield is de Lacy. So these new families are introduced. They quickly carve up large areas of the island, and they become the engine for colonial expansion in Ireland throughout the later 12th, but primarily the 13th century. Once we kind of hit the 1230s, the colony is very much pushing forward. And these lands, these estates that are created, these lordships that are created, are sub-infeudated over the course of the later 12th and 13th century. So you get a migration from England, peasants, artisans, the ethnic makeup of the eastern seaboard and gradually creeping westwards of the island, that changes over the course of this period. Now, this is a very quick, very kind of general overview of what's happening, but I would sum it up by saying by 1300, most of the island is under English lordship, or under effective English lordship. About 3/4 of the island, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, are quite effectively controlled. The English crown can exercise its authority through the colonial nobility. And within this world, the horizons of the Irish kings shrink significantly. So the power of these Irish kings, and these Irish kings had sought to dominate the island for a long time. Some of them came close to doing it before the 1160s, but their horizons physically shrink. They shrink into smaller territories. And many are forced into compromising agreements with the crown and with the colonists. And just by way of comparison, this, for the 13th century at least, this stands in stark contrast with Wales, where some of the Welsh princes are able to negotiate. Well, I know it all by the late 13th century matters changed, but early on in the kind of 12th, 13th century, early 13th centuries, the princes of Gwynedd and Powys and places are able to negotiate better agreements with the English crown. They're able to. That does not happen in Ireland. There is no security of tenure for the Irish kings. The example of the kings of Connacht is a particularly good example, where their lordship, their kingdom, is effectively picked apart by the colonists, and they have no royal protection. So in many respects, there is little incentive for the Irish lords, the Irish kings, or the Irish kings or lords as they begin styling themselves. There's very little incentive for them to behave. So it is a difficult relationship between the colonists, the colonial caste, and the indigenous Irish aristocracy. Now, moving forward, over the course of the 14th century, things begin to change. And again, this is a very kind of broad brushstrokes overview. But over the course of the 14th century, English power declines across the island. Okay, and we can break it down to kind of 4 key factors. Thinking about this in a simplified way, the first is the Bruce invasions of Ireland. Another very nice little animation there. When England and Scotland go to war, and the reasons for this are debated, but the Scots invade Ireland in 1315, possibly to open a second front against the English, prevent the English using Ulster as a base of operations to invade Scotland. It goes pear-shaped from the Scottish point of view. The Scots are all cut down in 1318, but it does lasting damage to the colony in Ulster, the Earldom of Ulster, and has a ripple effect across the rest of the island. The second key factor is the Little Ice Age, a period of fluctuating yet gradually cooling temperatures that affects most of Eurasia. But we see this borne out in Ireland as well, where the crops are affected, the growing season shortens by a year, the growing season shortens by a month each year over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries. You would get crop failures, there's a shortage of food, livestock, sheep and cattle are also affected quite badly as well. So the Little Ice Age has an impact on the coherence, the integrity of the English lordship. Very importantly, we get the Black Death, which arrives in the late 1340s, early 1350s. That does considerable damage to the colonial lordship, the English lordship in Ireland, affecting the towns particularly badly, as far as we can tell, based on the limited records. Now, these phenomena also affect the Irish as well. Again, the Irish are not spared the impact of the Little Ice Age. But the way, without going into too much detail, the way that the Irish society is structured in terms of its agriculture, in terms of its population structures, in terms of settlement, that seems to mitigate against these phenomena to some degree. We can talk about that later if you wish. And finally, we get the Gaelic migrations, which you can see those two little Vikings are, of course, a completely accurate representation of these soldiers. But the Gaelic migrations, these are soldiers from the West Highlands and Islands of Scotland that migrate to Ireland in the course of the 14th century, and they provide Irish lords with a keen military edge in their wars against the English. So collectively, these dynamics, they undercut English power across large areas of the island. Ulster in particular, which bears the brunt of the Bruce invasions, but also along the western seaboard more generally. So as a result, English power retreats eastwards to the more heavily anglicised eastern seaboard. And we get the re-emergence of several key Irish families. I'm just going to highlight a few here. There's about 60 I could name, but I'm going to give you the top four. Well, not quite the top four, but four important ones. The first, the O'Neills or the Ineal of Tyrone in green. Second, the O'Donnells or the Egonal of Tyrconnell, modern day Donegal in yellow. Next, we've got the Ivreen or the O'Briens of Thomond in purple. And we've got the McCarrig or McCarthy's of Desmond in southwest Munster. They're just some of the few main families that become the new household names in Ireland in the course of the over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, that's a couple of hundred years covered in the space of 5 or 6 minutes. I want to move on now and talk about some of how historians have understood these developments, these historical processes, because this is quite interesting for thinking about, the Mortimers and their place in Ireland. So there's been a lot written on the nature of English decline in this period. So the traditional line of interpretation, so that of Edmund Curtis, Jocelyn Oswey Ruthven, James Lydon, they all stressed the decline of the English colony. The colony is declining, that's undeniable, but they painted a picture of almost atrophy and the colony atrophying at an alarming rate. So much so, in some of the studies, you get a sense that if you just take those studies at face value, the colony appears to be on the verge of collapse. Collapse is imminent. Across 200 years, right down to the 16th century, the colony appears to be on the verge of collapse, according to some of these historians. Now, more recently, scholars have sought to look beyond this kind of quite simplistic narrative, and they've emphasized adaptability. Okay, I would say the most important historian here has probably been Robin Frame, and Frame in kind of a series of, I think, quite remarkable studies, and as he would say himself, rather than looking at why the colony was declining, he was more focused on what the colony was like. Okay, how was it functioning? It is still continuing to function. So he challenged this idea of kind of unrelenting, unremitting decline by looking at the evidence. So he talked about the breadth of justiciars' military campaigns across the island. So how they're able to, justiciars, the chief officer in the colony, the effective governor of the colony. You find them active in Ulster. You find them active down in Leinster. They can move across the island pretty quickly. They can raise troops pretty effectively at certain periods. They're militarily active. They respond to threats quite effectively. This is not to say that they're extending the colony outwards or anything, but you do have there is evidence that the colony is able to marshal its military resources pretty effectively in this period. Okay, so that would suggest that the colony is maybe not flourishing. It's not flourishing, I don't think, but certainly it is viable. It is very much viable. He's looked at the evidence for the colonists being able to extract revenue from, particularly from the eastern seaboard, but he has highlighted several very interesting instances where the colonists are able to, or the government in Ireland is able to raise taxes from, parts of Ulster, parts of West Munster as well. So there are some interesting ideas there. Most importantly, though, and I think this is Peter Crooks and others have talked about this, is the evidence for the colonial nobility participating in the king's enterprises overseas. So this is people like the Earl of Ormond, people like the Earl of Kildare or the Earl of Desmond, raising a military retinue and going on royal service, military service to Scotland or France. That tells us a lot about how the colony is functioning at this time, that these men are able to leave their territories in Ireland, which is effectively a war zone, and campaign on behalf of the king for sustained periods of time overseas. That would suggest that they're reasonably comfortable in their own territories in Ireland. So that's something to think about. What mechanisms are in place in Ireland that allow them to leave and go abroad on campaign? Something to think about. And I mentioned Peter, Brendan Smith, and a couple of others have also talked about, the viability of the colony in this period. Now, one thing that shines through within all of this research when talking about the colony, talking about the colonists, is their identity. And there is this line of argument that they self-consciously viewed themselves as English. Okay, I think, did they? That's a question I want to ask. In a very, 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 very simple answer, yes, they did view themselves as English, but it needs to be qualified. So that's what I want to move on and talk about next. So we talk about the debate on the nature of English power, but now I want to talk a little bit about Gaelicization. So Gaelicization, it's again, there's nothing new here. It's well known, and this is how I would, I suppose, define it, that from the later 12th century right down to the close of the Tudor period, the colonial nobility, or the colonial community in Ireland, that's a better way of describing it, the colonial community took on various aspects of Irish culture. Okay, so like they started dressing like the Irish. They started speaking Irish. They married into Irish families. In some cases, they remodeled their lordship along Irish lines. Okay, so they adopted Irish customs. In some cases, they abandoned English customs altogether. The way they treat succession changes, the way they manage inheritance changes, the use of fosterage with collateral or cadet branches of the family. They become great patrons of the Irish literati, of Irish literature and Irish culture in this period. Okay. And again, traditionally, historians have talked about this idea, this kind of statement that you'll find in many of the main history books, more Irish than the Irish themselves, that the English nobility of Ireland during the later Middle Ages, they imbibed so much of Irish culture that they became more Irish than the Irish themselves. So this idea, it's a major point of friction within Irish historical studies. And again, on the previous couple of slides, I talked about a traditionalist school that emphasized decline and a revisionist school that emphasized resilience. The traditional school, and you can these historians more or less, the same historians more or less fall into the same categories. But again, James Lydon, Edmund Curtis, others, they talked about, the colonial nobility became subsumed into the socio-cultural world of Gaelic Ireland. They became unruly. They became totally unreliable subjects. And the unreliability of the English of Ireland, because they'd become Gaelicized, that necessitated the Tudor conquest of the 16th century. That's kind of how it was understood, how they conceived of it. Now, the revisionist school, and again, Robin Frame has been so important here, these later historians made the case that taking on aspects of Irish culture was simply a characteristic of frontier lordship. You're a lord of English descent in Ireland. Let's say you're Butler or Fitzgerald. You're potentially surrounded by hostile Irish enemies. How can you protect yourself? How can you try and mitigate against the threat posed by the Irish? Well, you try and behave like the Irish. You forge alliances with the Irish. You speak Irish. You try and manage things locally. So again, this idea of Gaelicization is it's a symptom of adaptability. And the key thing is that these families remain English. Now, we'll talk about that in a little more detail shortly. Again, these families, how do they remain English while doing everything in an Irish manner? We'll talk about that shortly, because I think that is a really interesting topic. But I would sum it up. This idea, the extent to which the colonial community in Ireland interact with Irish culture, it's clearly an uncomfortable topic in Irish historical studies. Nobody can agree on anything. And I would say it's probably generated more heat than light, the debate. And it's probably, people are probably going to get very cross with me for saying that, but that's how I would understand the debate. I feel there's something missing. I'm not going to provide an answer to it tonight, but we might think of a few possible solutions. We can have a chat about that afterwards. Okay. So this is a complex world which we're talking about, okay? And first of all, I would say the colonial nobility and the colonial community across the island, it is itself highly regionalised. Those who live in Dublin are different from those who live in Waterford, are different from those who live in Limerick and Kerry, okay? And they're very different from those who live west of the Shannon in Connacht, okay? So the colonial community in Ireland, the different groups interact differently with Irish culture across the island. And this varies in intensity, geography, and chronology. So if we take the period, the early period, if you like, from the late 12th century through to 1300, the colonial aristocracy are interacting with Irish culture, and they're using this as a means of projecting English power, okay, through marriage alliances. Okay, so the initiative is very much with the colonists in this period, and they're able to project English power by marrying into Irish families, by allying with Irish families. After that, in the 2 centuries after that, the ability to operate across these different cultural worlds becomes key to survival. The colonists are under a lot of pressure in this period. The initiative has swung in favour of the Irish. So the ability to interact with the Irish becomes key to survival. So thinking about if you can ally with friendly or potentially friendly Irish families, that can help protect you in this period. Okay, so that's a distinction I would make. Yes, the interaction of the colonial nobility with Irish culture, it is an aspect of frontier lordship, as Robin Frame would love it, but it depends what part of the island you're looking at and what period. And we can break this down further into 2 key categories. So on the western seaboard, and I'm talking about the late Middle Ages, 14th and 15th centuries here. The western seaboard, Connacht mainly, the families there of English ancestry are largely subsumed into the, I'll talk about an example shortly, they're largely subsumed into the socio-cultural world of Gaelic Ireland, and they have very limited interaction with the state. And by 1400, they are virtually indistinguishable from their Irish neighbours. The eastern seaboard is different. When I say the eastern seaboard, I mean kind of Leinster and parts of Munster. Okay, so the colonial dynasties there in places like Tipperary, Kilkenny, Cork, they interact with Irish families to protect themselves, but also to preserve English influence. Okay, so there is a difference between what's happening in the eastern seaboard, the more heavily anglicised areas, the areas where the crown is more effectively able to assert itself, that being Leinster, Munster, and Connacht. And we see this reflected in the historical record. These regions have a more extensive engagement with the state, and they are more identifiably English than their Western counterparts, at least from a historian's perspective. So I want to look at two quick case studies first of all, and I promise this all comes back to the Butlers, so bear with me, please. Okay, so the first case study anyway are the Burghs of Connacht. Now again, the Burghs of Connacht were a cadet branch of the main comital family of Ulster, so the Burgh Earls, from whom the later Earls of March are descended, or from whom they claim their vast Irish inheritance. Over the course of the mid-14th century, the Burkes, they carve out two main lordships in Connaught. There's a map on a slide shortly. There's Íochtar Connaught, which means Lower Connaught, which is basically coterminous with County Mayo today. Excuse me. And Uachtar Connaught, Upper Connaught, which is more or less along the lines of County Galway. Now, these two families are heavily Gaelicized. They are of English or Anglo-French ancestry. Their ancestors had ranked among the most important colonial magnates in Ireland, but by the 14th, 15th centuries, they've become thoroughly Gaelicized. So they've intermarried with the Irish, they've fostered children with Irish families, they've rebranded or restructured how they organize their lordship. So, for example, the branch in Mayo abandoned primogeniture in the mid-15th century. And by the early 1400s, there is evidence to suggest they are monoglot speakers of Irish. Okay, they also stand among the most famous or most important patrons of the Irish literati. So they're totally subsumed into the world of Gaelic Ireland. Okay, with there's very little interaction with Dublin or the English lordship at this point. Okay, so they patronise a lot of bardic poetry. And bardic poems in this period are they are collected and put in a dúnadh, which is a poem book. It's the Irish word for poem book. I'll come back to dúnadh again shortly. They also sponsor the famous Seancus na Morcach, which is a genealogical history of the Burgh family, the Burkes, in Irish and Latin. And this is really important. It's not intended for an English audience. None of the material they patronise is intended for an English audience. It's intended for Irish-speaking audiences, okay? But at the same time, all these texts they produce, they stress the genealogical identity of their family, which is English, okay? And this is something that the late Kenneth Nichols, talked about, that your genealogical identity is key here, right? That's what determines your identity to a large extent in this period. The Burkes, even though they're virtually indistinguishable from their Irish neighbours, they're distinguished by their ancestry. That is important. Okay. Now, the other key case today I'd like to talk a little bit about is the Butler Earls of Orban. Now, I'm conscious of the clock, so I'm going to, well, not rush through this, but we'll skip over a few little bits. They are the most important colonial family in later medieval Ireland, and they're the Earls of Orban, based in Kilkenny, Tipperary. And they are very loyal to the crown. They serve as justiciars in Ireland, but also abroad in Scotland and France. And I would characterise their lordship as being Janus-faced. So they are great English peers. They're very important English earls, but they're also great Anglo-Irish warlords. Okay, the Butler lordship is thoroughly Gaelicized in this period. It's very like the Burke lordship in how power is exercised. So, for example, the Earl's legitimate children, the Earl is married, and his children will be married into the English nobility and preserve the link with England. But he also has numerous mistresses that result in numerous illegitimate children. And these illegitimate children are married into neighbouring Irish families. So the Earl's dynastic strategy is quite effective. You maintain strong links with your legitimate children through the English world, through court, but you maintain power in Ireland by marrying your illegitimate children into the neighbouring Irish families. So the earldom is predominantly Irish-speaking. Brehon law, that's the law of the Irish, is used throughout. The Earl's court, which is based in Kilkenny, is full of Irish figures. So he's political, his allies are at court. He also has literary figures from Gaelic Ireland, of course, the poets, the historians, the medical doctors. His court there's a really strong Irish flavour at the Earl's court. And importantly, the Earl he's very well respected within Gaelic Ireland. How do we know this? Well, James Butler, the fourth Earl of Ormond, who dies in 1452, he was a die-hard Lancastrian loyalist. He fought for Henry V in France. He may have. There's one local tradition that he fought at Agincourt. That's not clear. It's very hard to prove. But he's certainly in France after Agincourt for a few years. Anyway, in the 1440s, he commissioned bardic poetry. He got Taig O'Higgin, who was the premier poet of the day. He was the best poet in Ireland, the most famous poet. He wrote poems to the most powerful Irish and Scottish magnates. And the Earl commissioned him to write the poem Eden Éireann an Tíorla, the Earl has become a stranger in Ireland. And this is a fascinating text, very much underappreciated. It commemorates Butler's service to Henry V in France, fighting in the 100 Years' War. Okay? So it talks about the Earl's career fighting in France. It depicts him as an Irish king or an Irish lord, various imagery used, but it talks about his career fighting for the English king. It's not written for an English audience. It's written for an Irish audience. That's so fascinating, I think. Talking about the 100 Years' War in an Irish text. So again, cultural flexibility has significant political benefits. Okay, right. Back to the Mortimers. Now, feel free to disagree with me about this, but it's highly unlikely that the Mortimers could have recovered their lands with direct military force in the 14th to 15th centuries. The Gaelic aristocracy are very, very strong. And if we just look at the Tudor conquest, how difficult it was for the Tudors to make any headway in the 16th century, that gives us an idea of how well entrenched Irish lordship is becoming. But we can talk about that later on. So, but my point is that had the Mortimers lived longer, is there anything to suggest that they would have engaged with Irish culture in a meaningful sense? Could they have followed the Butler model and used culture and cultural flexibility to, if not recover the lands that the lands in Connacht, the lands in Ulster, that they could have come to some sort of arrangement with the Irish lords there? Now, I'm conscious that my time is nearly up, so I just want to look at a couple of areas very briefly. Dynasticism, law, and literature. Okay, the first one, dynasticism. The Earls already possessed royal or princely Welsh blood. So if you look back to the marriage of, so I've spelled Ralph's name wrong, Ralph Mortimer to Gladys Dhu, the daughter of, I believe, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth. So the Mortimers have Welsh princely blood to that marriage. And that's something that the Welsh poets emphasised during the Wars of the Roses later on when they talk about Edward IV. Now, the Mortimers also had Irish blood, okay? William de Burgh, the first English Lord of Connacht, he married Anya Niamh around 1200. So Roger Mortimer, who died in 1398, he was the first of the Mortimers to have Irish blood, and if that makes sense, because of who his mother was. So that's important. Now, were the Irish literati aware of this connection? I honestly don't know. There's a couple of things I want to look at, a couple of genealogies to see. But the Mortimers certainly had that card to play, this connection with the Irish. The Welsh connection is really evident, but there was an Irish blood connection as well. Dynastically, there was also the potential for marriage alliances. Could illegitimate families, I'm not saying that, but again, for example, members of the Mortimer family, illegitimate members or otherwise, could they have been married into other Irish families in a way that following the strategy that the Butlers followed? So again, we see something similar in I know this is a very particular example, when Sir Edmund marries Catherine, the daughter of Owen Glendour in around 1404, 1405. This willingness to engage with Welsh culture, okay? We may have seen something similar in Ireland. Again, there's plenty of examples of this happening in Ireland, where we looked at the Butlers, but the Burghs did something similar, the Lacys earlier on. Okay, just a couple more minutes and we finished. Looking at the idea of law, the Statute of Crudlin in 1284, we had this limited recognition of Welsh customs and traditions, which becomes more accepted during the course of the late Middle Ages. The Butlers used Brehon law to administer their lordships in Ireland. Okay. There's no reason that the Mortimers wouldn't have done something similar and used Brehon law in the territories if they had followed this strategy. Finally, just looking at the idea of literature, we all know that Roger was the subject of a praised poem by Iolo Gach, where he was encouraged to subdue that misshapen dog blockhead of Ulster. He was referring to Niall Mór O'Neill, the ruler of Tyrone. So the Mortimers engaged with Welsh bardic culture. there's no reason to think the Mortimers would not have used the services of Irish bards. Again, the Butlers were doing it, the Fitzgeralds were doing it, the Earls of Desmond were doing it. Okay, as I said, all the main Irish comital houses used them superbly, really effectively. There was potential to have genealogical histories written. Again, the example of the Burkes, the Burghs, they had Shankus and the Moorcock written in the 16th century. Would the Mortimers have engaged with Irish literary, actual Irish literature? So, for example, the Library of Gerald, 9th Earl of Kildare, who dies in 1534, it was full of books in Irish, including books on Irish mythology. So we know the Fitzgeralds were reading or were having read to them stories about, the Finn cycle, Cuchulainn, and all of those. Right. So as I said, a military conquest I don't think was possible. Certainly the crown, without enormous crown investment, which the crown simply wasn't willing to do until the Tudor period. And even then, the Tudor conquest is a very close run thing. So is the pen mightier than the sword? Quite possibly. Cultural assimilation or a willingness to be flexible has considerable benefits. So the soft power approach can work very well. And we see this very much from the Butlers. I've talked a lot about the Butlers, but there are other examples in Ireland. The Mortimers could have availed of these strategies. That again, the experience from Wales would suggest so. They had Welsh blood. They also had Irish blood from Roger onwards, and also they'd used Iolo Gach. And there's no reason to say that they couldn't have used Irish bards. Finally, would we have seen a Mortimer poem book, a Dúnra? If so, it might have been called something like this, Dúnra an Vortimerig. Thank you very much.